Okay. From doing a 6-hour workshop on frantic assembly, we learned a lot about what frantic assembly was, how they devise some contemporary applications, and then what we'll be using and some of their ideas that we'll be using when we're doing our own piece inspired by their company. Basically, some insight into what we already knew about Frantic Assembly. Obviously, we knew that they were a physical theatre company. Devising pieces is often what they do. They look at movement and natural movement and things like closing gaps and create an abstract movement with what feels right. So it was like a lot of things that were set together that would create a weird shape, like guiding each other or having interesting lifts, but adding them in when they felt natural and collaborating together as a team, because it's quite a collaborative kind of style. So when we were first introduced, the leader told us a lot about some of the ways that he devises, and he took us through some exercises. I'm going to talk through just some of them and what some of the things that we did, some of the key moments of the workshop, what I thought about them, and then how we might use them when we're looking at the style itself. So we looked at, first of all, collaborating, working together with different partnerships. I feel like in Frantic Assembly there are different levels to which you have a different amount of people, so you can do things on your own, you can do things in duets, trios, and you can do things in bigger groups, and the size and the amount of people often depends on the kind of thing you want to show. So with the bigger lifts that we did later on in the workshop were done with more people, obviously because you need to distribute that weight and you can lift them up higher and stuff. And there were like smaller, like squeeze duets and movements and lifts done by another person that were done with only 2 people and only required 2 people. So we looked at initially this exercise where you have to guide somebody with your hand. It sounds fairly simple, but they would guide the other person with their hand. So it would have a gap. There would be a gap between their face and the other person's hand, and you would have to follow it. This allowed for the person to create some interesting shapes, for the duet to create some interesting shapes, but it was also about trust, about partnership, about the movement itself. So trusting the movement and not making it too jolty, because if you followed the movements then it would create a fluid shape, whereas if you didn't really trust and you kept stopping and starting, it would break the piece. So we did that, and I think that was also to show how Frantic Assembly is about building trust. The trust between a partnership or a group is really important, especially when you're doing types of things like certain lifts and certain holds. You need to be able to distribute weight, and you need to be able to trust each other to do what you need to do to execute it. So I think that's interesting and useful as a way to sort of get us into it. Some of the lifts that we did were ones where they would fall sideways, and some were lifted over the head, and some were across the body. So when he talked about the guy running it, when he talked about the whole idea behind it was to make sure that there were no gaps. So the gaps were sealed so that it was tight between bodies, and so that it wasn't about, a particular person's strength. It was about distributing weight so that you could create these shapes and you could create these effects without having to have someone really strong and lift the other person up in the air. Especially with the one where you're standing sideways, the weight and the gaps are all sealed up, so the weight is just distributed evenly on the floor, and you can lift the other person a lot easier. When doing these, found them quite tricky at first, but I think they were useful in showing how they start to create ideas by looking at different gaps that they could fit into. That's how they created these lifts in the first place, and that's how they devise a lot of their pieces. Because as well with Frantic Assembly style, the guy talked about how they first focus on movement and working together, collaboration to create that movement, and then talk about character motivations, script, feelings, storylines that might come with that. So when then creating later pieces in the workshop, he often told us to feel about the movement and experiment with that, and have a lot of time to experiment with that. And then a feeling will sort of follow, and you and your partner should have this sort of feeling that you build, and that might influence the movement slightly, but you'll mainly have the movement together, and it's the way that the audience perceives it. Which brings me to the next exercise that we did. We had to pick, we were in duets, and we had to pick 3 points on our partner's body and draw lines from one to the other. When doing this, we had to think about how big we wanted to draw the lines, whether we wanted to draw the lines off the body, across the body, round the body, taking turns to draw the lines from one to the other, and then creating this piece of movement, creating and adding in the lifts that we'd learned earlier. And it was about building up the skills to actually creating a piece. So we'd looked at obviously trust, we'd looked at those lifts before, we'd looked at the movement, and then the feeling that came afterwards with it. He said, what sort of things does it make you think of? And this will automatically bring about a storyline, even if you're not intending for it. And it's often I felt it was often up to the audience that the storyline would be determined. A lot of other factors. I didn't realise as well that Frantic Assembly experiment with like lighting and sound and different sort of things that he experimented about when showing each other these line duets. When points he would change the positioning, so he'd make the duets do it on the floor, he'd add in lifts, he'd add a piece of music to it, he'd make it darker, and it would automatically give a feel to the piece. And I think in a lot of their pieces they do the same thing, and it gives the character motivation, it gives a feeling to it. And we talked about a lot of discussion about what a person could perceive. So when looking at for example Marlon and Jade's, when Jade stepped out and Marlon was the one who had to do the piece on his own, it gave a sense of loss. Often the old style music that he played on top of it gave a retro kind of feel, and it sort of seemed really sad beforehand if the high energy levels were different, or there was an upbeat piece of music that could have been perceived as a totally different type of thing. I think when we're creating our own piece, I think we need to look at what we've previously done and look at the movement itself, what we think we could devise as a big group, and then link together and evaluate and have a big discussion about how it links together and what feelings each piece gives to have a main storyline. We also looked at this bigger lifts, so like a Calippo lift, and something like the flying lifts. So these were about just making sure, this was more about like the logistics of how Frantic do their lifts, so making sure you have a rock, a base, and then other people to hold certain points of the body, which meant that anybody could be lifted, and it gave an interesting effect depending on what sort of lift you were going for, the sort of status level, potentially power, potentially like fear or being lost. A lot of like those 4 sort of feelings were often, I've sort of felt, could have been shown through what we were doing. And which also next we did was something called Bodyguard. And our bodyguard was when we we were in smaller groups this time, but we had one person that would walk around and the others would have to surround this person, allow them to move where they wanted to move but catch them when they fell. And we created a sequence where they would move around, the others would catch them when they fall or lift them when they fell, and it would create different feelings like before. Particularly in when they're going to change like the lighting and stuff as well, because in some of the other groups when watching, and I think it's often to do with collaboration, because you might like an idea that you saw in a different group, and I think that's what sets Frantic Assembly apart, because you could be doing exactly the same thing but end up with total different outcomes depending on what you've decided to do with it. So when watching, for example, one group's, he changed the lighting, and at some points there were like some interesting shadows. There was a sense of danger, I felt, and a sense of like confusion, because there were all these people surrounding this main character. It was hard to see the person in the middle apart from when they were lifted up, and so I felt like when they were lifted up, it was like they were having this sense of freedom and then back into chaos again. And it could be taken as a physical representation, maybe of drowning, or a mental or metaphorical of like lost in confusion and stress, and like connotations to like some sort of mental health issue. So when looking at that, those were my thoughts on that part. And finally we finished off with a slightly different sort of feeling I felt, or technique, where we had to attach nerves, pretend nerves back to our heart, to the centre, and we did it from different parts of our bodies, from like legs and arms and heads and eyes, and it was all about like mixing it up, creating the sense of pulling it back to the centre part, and it created this weird abstract like movement to it that you didn't really realise until you finished and you saw yourself doing it. It was an interesting way of creating some interesting shapes without really thinking about it too much. We then came together and showed other people our pieces. We came together as threes and showed each other, taught each other, and created a sequence from it, looking at potentially using chairs, other props that we hadn't used so far, and lighting and new techniques that we'd thought about. And I think that from looking at everything that we learned about Frantic Assembly, it was all to do with like natural movement, making it abstract by exaggerating it, by doing things that are unconventional, and that was the thing that drives their performances, that drives their devised pieces. And then they build on it with like feelings and thoughts and motivations and things like that. So that's what I thought of our first Frantic workshop.